Okay, so we're going to go through 8 days in a corset. And as with your other Module C texts, you don't need to be doing a particularly in-depth analysis of these texts. It's more about understanding how they use stylistic features in order to portray some kind of commentary about the society that we live in, or the society that they live in. So when we look at 8 days in a corset, the composer's really using sort of two key motifs to look at the idea of how an individual creates their identity, or could have their identity and sense of self be limited in some way. And this, of course, is, a pretty key idea from a human experience perspective. And that's really what markers are looking for. Have you been able to identify a key aspect of the human condition that you've been able to then explore through using stylistic features that, have potentially been emulated or that have been emulated from these more experienced writers. So right from the outset, we've got an anecdotal opening. Several summers ago, I worked as an extra in the film. So really good to, draw the reader in by starting with something a bit personal, like what's your little story that you can sort of give us a bit of an introduction into your piece with. So that's how she starts there. Then she brings in the whole thing about the corset, and the corset's got all these multifaceted, it's very multifaceted because it's like, we expect that it's going to be something that's really limiting and it's, very oppressive to women. And she does sort of talk about that. But, the corset is a vilified article of clothing. But she actually also takes a bit of a different spin on it, where she talks about the fact that in some ways it's almost transformative and liberating to be able to just wear an item of clothing, maybe just because it's not a permanent thing, to be fair. But, you can put a piece of clothing on and you can sort of take on this different persona, be a different person and, live that for a little bit of time. And that's really what she kind of continues on with her notion, with her discussions about clothing. And she does talk about mirrors in a kind of an interesting way. She sort of talks about them as being sort of limiting in some way. She always talks about it really negatively, and how it's, somehow jarring, or it, takes her sense of self away, sort of a dislocated sense of self. But ultimately what she starts looking at is that freedom can be created through the idea that clothing, can be changed, and you can, it can be creative. It can also be really limiting as well. So I want to just touch on the idea of being trapped versus being free. So these ideas work really well in your pieces, whether it be narrative, discursive. You want to touch on the idea that there are certain things, like human beings have an innate desire to be free and to escape from entrapment. So what you'll find is if you can incorporate those ideas into your pieces, they're really, really effective, and they actually work really well with a lot of different questions. If you actually look at lots of questions, you'll see that that idea of freedom is in a lot, is a key kind of idea in those questions. I did create another video, which you definitely go and look at, about how to use motifs of creating. So whether it be writing, playing music, cooking, maybe art. In this case, she's using the creation of clothing to show how an individual, sense of self can be transformed and how it can be liberated or trapped. Okay, that is so crucial. If you can do that in your piece, you will be getting a band 6, basically. Okay, so just going through another couple of techniques. She's talking about the truth about clothes, hairdos, and makeup have never hit me so hard. The cultural trappings of sex are overwhelming. So going to that idea of it being limiting, but we make them and live them and are them. So that's a good technique too, actually, that I want to highlight. It's a quarter tricolon. I love this technique. I think it's such a clever way of just punching out. You've got 3 ideas, hence the tri. And it just sounds so good when you actually do it. So if you can incorporate one of those stylistically in your writing, it will sound amazing. So just moving on, we've got, the idea that, again, she's talking about fashion and how that reflects gender. There's a lot of stuff about how fashion and clothing reflects gender, and that's how she's brought that broader idea into society. She's saying any meaningful piece of clothing is part of a broader cultural story. So again, she's talking about gender and sense of self through using that motif of clothing, which is Again, if you can use like motif, tricolon, anecdote, you've got 3 great techniques for your own piece that you can adopt from what she's written here. Just skip to the end here. So in the end, wearing clothes is an act of imagination and invention of self, a fiction. So that's sort of like a tricolon as well. You've got the 3 ideas. It's the imagination, invention of self, fiction. So again, really punchy, really effective stylistic feature, and leaves you with that whole idea that, as we said, that clothing can provide freedom. It is a sense of creation, very similar to writing. Everything I said, those like sort of artistic metaphors or motifs that can be really good in your writing. And she sort of comes to a conclusion in the end where she's sort of bringing it all back to like that sense of self, and so forth. So, if you just get a couple of these really good techniques, you don't need a lot of analysis here. As you can see, I've just sort of popped through, but, picked up on a couple of really good ones that you can obviously use. And then you adopt that notion to come up with your idea about what's your social thing that you want to be talking about. Is it gender? Is it class? Is it democracy? Is it environmental, humans' impact on the environment? Is it, what is it? There's so many issues out there. There's so many topical things that you could be talking about. So have a think about how you can adopt her features to write your own great piece.